Okay, so this is my inquiry and action plan project. This presentation is going to go through what my guiding question was, why I chose it, all of the people that were involved in the making of this presentation. It's going to start out with a little bit of a background on the two different schools that I've worked at, go into the questions with the teachers, admin, and students that were actively involved in helping me with this, and then finally it's going to talk about my plan of action, if you will, and what I hope to implement into my school based on everything that I have learned. Okay, so for this project, I chose to work with the community-based activity and advocacy question number 2 from Nieto's book. It was in chapter 10, the one that was called Nice is Not Enough. What she said was initiate a reading group on discussions of race and inequality in schools. You may want to ask each teacher to write an essay about their own, in parentheses, successful or unsuccessful, experiences of addressing issues of race and inequality. She also gave a suggestion for a book to start with that contains essays from researchers and teachers addressing these issues. So I took this question and changed it a little bit into more of a discussion group in general. We didn't really do any readings, but I also wanted to get students' perspectives on the issue of race and inequality within the school system. So I asked a lot of my students from different backgrounds to answer questions that I'll be going over in the upcoming slides. So I chose this topic because I think it's really important for us as teachers and as a society, especially in today's global climate and our political climate in our country, to be aware of the biases and struggles that so many of our students face that we as teachers are probably very blind to. So whether or not the biases are intentional, bias and inequality in schools is still very much alive today, and I hope to someday help change the perception people have on specific groups of students. And this project is just kind of a launching pad for that. So before getting into the discussions that I had with the teachers and administrators and the questions that I asked students to respond to, I think it's important to give you guys an idea about the ethnic makeup and the diversity, or lack thereof, of the two high schools that I've worked at. So I taught at Lakewood High School in Jeffco for 2 years before coming to Fairview in Boulder Valley last year. Both schools excel academically and athletically. They're ridiculously smart students and very athletic kids. I actually just found out that Fairview has more students accepted into Stanford University than any other high school in the nation besides Palo Alto, which is the high school right next door to Stanford, and that Lakewood is in the top 5 high schools in the nation for National Merit Scholar finalists. Both schools are IB schools. Lakewood has a much bigger program than Fairview does, but they are both definitely in the top performing schools in the state as well as the country. So Lakewood is a predominantly white school at about 54%, but 33% of the student body is Hispanic. So when I was teaching there, we had 5 classes in Spanish that were only offered to native speakers. And Lakewood also has 34% or so of the student body that qualifies for the free and reduced lunch program. So switching to Fairview for me was a pretty big shock just because of the sheer amount of affluence that the school had. It's an incredible school. The students are awesome, but it definitely is a different environment walking through the halls of Fairview versus the halls at Lakewood. So Fairview affluence is the majority. At Lakewood, it was definitely the minority. And Fairview is much whiter than Lakewood. So 72% of the population is white and only 11% is Hispanic. I think less than 1% is African American. There's also 0 native Spanish speaker only classes offered, and compared to Lakewood's 34% that qualifies for free and reduced lunch, only 11% of the population at Fairview qualifies for it. So Fairview does its best to kind of show its diversity. There are signs in Spanish in the front office when you walk in, and paintings of different cultures on the walls throughout the hallways that different students has done. But it's still a very quote unquote vanilla school, and that's what my students call it. And honestly goes for the staff too. So besides one Spanish teacher, literally the entire staff is white. We have different ethnicities represented on staff, but only one person out of the 124 teachers is not white. So while the majority of the population of Fairview is white, I can't really help but wonder what our minority students think about the lack of the diversity in the staff. So I remember reading an article from early on in this class. It was from the New York Times. It was called Does Teacher Diversity Matter in Student Learning? The author wrote that especially non-white students, so all students, especially non-white students, benefit from and oftentimes do better in schooling, even if it's just once in their career throughout school, that they have someone who looks like them who's teaching them. So for our, minority students, our Hispanic students, our Black students, our Asian students, are they feeling as though they're being a little bit secluded or left out because of the lack of diversity among the staff? Our entire admin team is white. Our special ed program is white. Again, everyone except for one science teacher. We're all white. All right, so now that you guys have a bit of an idea about the school where I work now and where I worked in the past, I'll finally get to the questions I asked teachers. So it kind of took me a while to come up with what types of questions I wanted to ask the teachers and the administration. So I'm going to include answers from every person that I spoke with, but I'm not going to go over every single question and every single answer, or we'd be here all day. So while interviewing people for this project, it was pretty clear early on that the majority of the students that we were talking about weren't necessarily Asian or Black students in that sense of the word minority, but they were instead the students whose first language wasn't English. Oftentimes it was Spanish, and were therefore considered quote unquote less educated for not knowing how to speak English. I remember reading a quote in the Nieto book that stated that we as a society really need to change our mindset, and instead of labeling people as those who can't speak English, why don't we consider them or label them as people who are fluent in a language other than English? So another quote also that really stood out to me when it comes to this topic was from the Ovando and Combs book when talking about the multiple revisions that occurred during the Bilingual Education Act. So it's from the U.S. Department of Education, and it states that proficiency in 2 or more languages should be promoted for all students. And as a Spanish teacher and someone who has firsthand experience with the benefits of speaking a second language, I could not agree more with, I 100% agree with this statement. For me personally, it has added so much to my life and has allowed me to have so many conversations with some incredible people with whom otherwise I really wouldn't have been able to communicate. So speaking another language from a firsthand experience has been extremely beneficial. And I think that it's something that we as an education system in Colorado and in the United States really need to look into, especially given the fact that so many of our students that we encounter are going to have a different native language at home besides English. So one of the first questions that I asked the teachers and administrators who helped me out with this was, do you think that there is a conscious or unconscious bias in the education system today? And without hesitation, every single one of them said yes. Each of them agreed that while it's unfair and unjust, that the bias definitely does exist and that each of them has their own personal bias as well, even though they, as my principal stated, really try and check it at the door. It does sometimes seep through and it's definitely still there. So my principal stated that even after 31 years in education, he still has a bias towards a specific group of people, not necessarily towards the students, but towards the parents because of multiple negative interactions he's had with them throughout his career. So he, when dealing with these students and parents, really tries to separate the student from the parent and realize that, my issue isn't with this student, it's with the parent, and it's not just the race, it's with the specific person. So one of the other teachers that I spoke to, Carolyn, she's a Spanish teacher at Fairview as well, and she stated that, quote, I do think there's some bias and inequality. I especially see this with language barriers. It seems like when a student speaks a different language, they can tend to be labeled as being behind or having less comprehension than others. They also tend to not pursue higher level classes like AP or IB, even though they could be capable. I feel like they don't even entertain the idea. I saw this at every school I have taught at, and here at FHS, it sadly seems like the students who speak another language are kind of outcast. They tend to be very quiet in my Spanish classes, usually the most quiet. It's almost like they're too embarrassed or too nervous to speak in their native tongue. End quote. So I can 100% agree with this, with what Carolyn said. I, as a Spanish teacher as well, have definitely noticed that the majority of the native speakers that are in my class are very hesitant to raise their hand and to offer up an explanation or even participate in general in the class unless directly called upon. Seems like they're really nervous because they don't want people to be looking at them more so than they already are. Another teacher that I talked to, she teaches AP US History and Government. Her name is Gabriella. She stated that schools are a microcosm of society, so it makes sense that some of the racial inequities have reproduced themselves in the school system as well. Gabriella also said that she has been and continues to be on the receiving end of racial assumptions and inequality. She's Mexican American, doesn't really speak a lot of Spanish, but her looks, her name, everything kind of screams Mexican, as she calls it. So she says that when she tells people that she's a teacher, people automatically assume that she's a Spanish teacher, and that sometimes people even assume her language abilities aren't as good as they are. So before even giving her a chance to speak, people will automatically slow down their speech, maybe speak a little bit louder, use more gestures when talking to her. So I asked 4 Mexican American students, 3 boys and a girl, 1 female Vietnamese student, and 2 black students, 1 brother and 1 sister, some questions as well, because I really wanted to get students' perspectives on this topic. While I think that it's very important to talk to teachers about this, I want to talk to the people who are more so affected directly by this than the teachers are. So an interesting result that I found as a result of these questions, was that while all the students reported having been racially stereotyped and on the receiving end of academic inequality, the female students' responses were overall a lot more positive than the male students were. The male students reported having faced multiple teachers throughout their schooling who would accuse them of disrupting the classroom without hesitation, even if they weren't doing anything wrong, or telling them to speak correctly, don't use slang, speak English when having a conversation with their friends. One of my Mexican American students, his name is Kevin, said that a lot of the times in class, he would feel as though the teacher would think he was dumber than other students, and, quote, they would never call on me when I raised my hand to answer a question. They always just assumed I was asking one instead. So I was reading this article. It was a study done by Johns Hopkins University in 2016 that said that the more modest expectations teachers have of some students versus others could eventually become self-fulfilling prophecies for those specific students. Lower expectations can impede performance, and even in severe cases, it could cause a student to drop out because of lack of self-confidence in their abilities. And as teachers, we have to make sure that we are not sending our students signals that they're anything less than 100% capable. It's really sad to me to think that some students, and maybe even in my classroom, have the feeling that they are less capable of others. So another student, Omar, he's also Mexican American, stated that he doesn't think that teachers give him the same attention and positive feedback as they do native English speaking students. For the brother and sister pair, I'm not going to name their names because they asked not to be. They said that the majority of their racial stereotyping comes in the form of sports, and people just automatically assuming that they play basketball or football because of their height and the color of their skin. However, they did mention to me that on 2 separate occasions, the brother is a junior, the sister is a freshman, that in their US history classes, when the teacher was talking about slavery, the teacher looked directly at them both, and they were each the only black student in the room at the time, and said, I know this must be really hard for you to hear, so you can leave if you want to. So when I asked how they responded, they said that they were both so shocked and embarrassed that they didn't say anything and just sank into their seats. So while I believe that the teacher probably had good intentions and didn't want them to feel singled out, the fact was that they felt blatantly singled out and judged just because of the color of their skin, and they didn't have the tools nor the words at that time to really react in a way that they may have wanted to. So the last student that I want to get to really fast is my Vietnamese student, and she said that her biggest area where she has felt the most racial stereotyped was in math class. She has struggled with math throughout her entire educational career, but she said that every time the teacher would ask the class to answer a question and no one would raise their hand, that the teacher would always look directly at her and say, hey, Cassie, why don't you help us out? And she said that the majority of the time, again, she would have no idea what was going on, but felt like because she was Asian, the teacher just assumed that she would have the answer. So another question that I asked teachers was, how do they address race in their classroom? Do they make it a point to learn about each student's background and ethnicity and then do their best to incorporate it into each lesson? Or do they simply realize, hey, I have a few different races in this classroom, and then move on with the lesson as planned? So all teachers said that unless a specific comment is made or question is asked, they normally try and leave the topic of race untouched and keep it in their classroom. It's an uncomfortable topic that I sometimes don't feel comfortable addressing, but I do my best to. And one of the admin put it that when she was a science teacher, she said, sometimes I would feel like I was being racist just by talking about race. I'm a white female, and talking about race to non-white students made me very uncomfortable because I didn't want them to judge me or think I was stereotyping. Another teacher said that unless I have first-hand experience with the topic that students are talking about, I try my best to stay away from it because I don't want to say something wrong. So race, I think, is always going to be a topic that makes some people nervous and uncomfortable, but students see teachers as role models. And if students see teachers, these people who are supposed to be modeling appropriate, mature behavior, wavering and kind of cowering at the sight and sound of the word race, how are students ever going to learn that it's okay and even necessary to talk about race and the differences that make up our classrooms and our world? For me personally, I think that ignoring it or acting like it's not there is the worst thing that we as educators could do to model to our students, because to some kids that may be sending a message that, well, race isn't important, we don't need to talk about this. While yes, I believe that all students should be treated equally, not every student is the same, and acting like there's no racial differences in the classroom can sometimes be, in my opinion, very ignorant on a teacher's part. So the last question that I asked everyone, including the students, was what we as educators can do to overcome the educational bias that is placed on students of color or minority students. So everyone agreed that it wasn't just one thing that teachers could do, and that this issue doesn't really have a quick fix or band-aid remedy. So my dad, who has been in education for over 30 years, he's a Spanish teacher as well, said that we can start by hiring a diverse faculty that mirrors the ethnicity of the students at any particular school. This kind of goes back to my point at the beginning when talking about the lack of diversity in Fairview staff. However, he did say that the most important thing that we as teachers can do is to model diversity, model acceptance, and model open-mindedness. Our students look to us every day for advice, knowledge, and appropriate behavior. We can't just talk the acceptance talk, we have to walk the walk too, or our words are going to fall on deaf ears. So when I asked students the same question, they all said that they think the best way to overcome the bias would be just to talk about it, to ask students' opinions, and to not pretend like it doesn't exist. So one student said that pretending like a bias in the education system doesn't exist against my people, he was one of my Mexican students, makes me feel like I'm being ignored and pushed aside. Like my opinion and my voice doesn't matter in the classroom. Other students said, just ask questions, admit when you don't know the answer to something, make us all feel equal and important, and don't just call on us because of our race. Don't assume that I know the answer because I can speak Spanish. And what Cassie said, don't assume I know the answer because I'm Vietnamese. So I think it's human nature for people to make assumptions about other people, but throughout this experience and interaction with these students and talking to them, it's my hope that at a young age we can start to overcome the stereotypes and biases placed on students so that eventually no one feels inferior or singled out. So this kind of leads into what my action plan for Fairview is going to be, and that's what I'm going to talk about on the next and final slide. So after gathering all this information, talking to the teachers and admin, and talking to the students, I had 1,001 different ideas running through my head about things that I wanted to do to kind of help stop this, racial inequality and stereotyping in its tracks. I know that that is a very broad and big goal to take on. So the following are going to be a few different things that I am hoping to start implementing into Fairview's culture starting next semester. One of these things we already have there, but my admin has been really awesome throughout this whole process and talking to them about different things that I want to do. Some of this involves things doing in my specific classroom, and some of this is a school-wide endeavor. So in my classroom, what I started doing at the beginning of this year was having all students given a Así soy yo presentation, and that means this is me. So what I want them to do at the beginning of the year, I'll give them about a week to get it done. These kids are just going to highlight who they are, what they like to do, where their family's from. It's going to be a bit of a historical piece on the students, and also just, hey, you know what, this is who I am. This is where my family's from. If they want to bring in any props, if you will, that they think really represent themselves, their culture, and their family, then that's definitely encouraged. So this year again was the first year that I did it, and kids did a really, really awesome job with it. I have kids from all different backgrounds that brought in a lot of different things. I have multiple kids that speak Polish. I have some that speak Yiddish. I have some Hebrew. I have a lot of native Spanish speakers. There's Vietnamese. And even the kids that said that they didn't really identify with specific culture because they called themselves, well, I'm just pure white, they brought in a lot of really cool things and traditions from their specific family. So I think that that helped them kind of realize, just because I don't identify as Mexican or as Vietnamese, I still have an important culture. So keeping the Así Soy Yo presentations is definitely something that I'm going to continue to do. Other Spanish teachers are actually doing that as well. So that makes me happy. Another thing that Fairview has done really well with over the past few years and that I want to continue to do is they have a culture week towards the end of the school year. It's at the end of April, and what that is people from all different backgrounds, and these are students who volunteer to be a part of it. There is an entire week where they are showcasing their culture in some way, shape, or form. They do different dances, so there's different music playing in the hallways. They have booths set up. It's kind of like a little carnival, if you will, without the rides, where you're walking around checking out the different booths. There's different pictures, there's foods, people dress up in their traditional clothing, and it's just really, really cool to see the differences in our school and in our student body, because looking at our student body, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of difference. So when you really get to interact with each of these kids and see the cultures that they come from, it's been a really cool experience. So that's something that I want to continue to do. Hopefully we can do it more than just once a year though. I think it'd be really cool to have it done at the beginning of the year versus the end, just as kind of an introduction to, hey, we're Fairview, this is who we are. So that's definitely a plan that I have in place with talking to admin. Another thing that I plan on doing or plan on implementing, if you will, and this is something that I need to get admin a little bit more on board with, but again, they've been really awesome with everything so far, is to showcase a different ethnicity in our school every single month. I want to have kids, and this is going to be something that is all voluntary, but we do the Pledge of Allegiance every day. So the Pledge of Allegiance will be said in a different language every day for a month. We do announcements every third period. So every third period during announcements, there would be a little spiel on, hey, here's a fun fact about Sweden. Did you know that blank? So giving students, just that quick tidbit of information about a society or culture or language that they may not have known otherwise. I think doing a lesson in languages because we have block lunches every Wednesday and Thursday, doing a lesson in different languages that isn't offered at the school is definitely something that's important as well, because we have French, Spanish, and Latin offered at the school, but we don't have any native Latin speakers, obviously. We have a few native Spanish speakers and even fewer French speakers. So I think incorporating and offering just little quick lessons in the languages that are commonly spoken in our school would be something that's really important for students to experience. The last thing that I want to do is incorporate different foods into the cafeteria. That's going to be something that I have to do next year, because the cafeteria plans out the meals for their food at the very beginning of the year. But again, with having a different ethnicity represented every month over the Pledge of Allegiance and over the announcements, I want to have that ethnicities and cultures food incorporated into the cafeteria and into the menu, whether it's once a week or throughout the entire month as well. So I think with all of these different things, it's going to help students in general feel a lot more connected to their peers and much more involved, and especially the students whose voices may fall to the wayside and whose voices they don't think are as important as the majority. Incorporating these different plans of action and having their voices heard, their culture showed, and the pride that they have in their culture, I think that that's going to be something that will bring our students even closer together and will definitely give us as teachers a better idea of who these students actually are. I always say that if the only thing I know about my students at the end of the year is what their name is and where they sat in my Spanish class, then I haven't done my job as a teacher. I want to know who my kids are, where they come from, what they eat, what their families are like, and this is going to be a really good way to show off the diversity in our school and the awesomeness of every single student that makes up the 2,200 plus kids at Fairview. So I hope you liked this presentation. I learned a lot from talking to my fellow teachers and talking to my fellow teachers and students. And I think that this is something that I'm really going to enjoy doing and implementing, because culture in general is something that's fascinating to me. I love traveling. I love learning about different people and different ways of life. So bringing this to the forefront of our school is going to be a really fun experience that I hope everyone gets on board with as well. Thank you.